She doesn't even get what we're saying." Douglas Ray didn't bother to lower his voice as he leaned back in his chair, bourbon glass catching the light. His grin was the kind that belonged to a man who assumed the room was his. Preston Hale snorted, swirling his drink. "$1 billion buyout for a silent robot? I'll take that deal any day." He tilted his head toward the end of the long walnut table, where Victor Tanaka sat perfectly still, eyes steady behind frameless glasses. "Look at him, Douglas. The man's a statue." Douglas chuckled, sharp and dismissive. "Maybe we should send him a set of flashcards, or hire someone to teach him how to answer a question." The rooftop restaurant, Skyline Hall, was a cage of glass and chrome perched above San Francisco's glittering bay. Candlelight slid across polished wood, chandeliers hovered like frozen waterfalls, and the city stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows in 1,000 points of gold. It was supposed to be a celebration, the closing dinner for a $1 billion merger between Tanaka Robotics and Regen Biotech. But the air hummed with something colder than champagne. At the far end, Victor Tanaka's hands rested lightly on the table. His expression gave nothing away. He had built his company from scratch in Osaka, survived markets and storms most of these men had only read about. Tonight, his calm was armor. A few feet behind the gleaming table, almost invisible against the dark marble, Leon Knight pushed a cleaning cart across the floor. His sleeves were rolled, palms calloused from years on the night shift. Next to the cart sat a small girl on a low stool, legs tucked beneath her. Kendra, 11, slim as a reed, her braids pinned neatly, a battered notebook balanced on her knees. She traced a row of kanji with a blunt pencil, lips moving silently. Preston glanced toward her without really seeing. "What's with the kid? Somebody bring their mascot?" Douglas smirked. "Probably the janitors. Cheap childcare, I guess." Their laughter scraped the room like grit on glass. Kendra's pencil paused. She didn't lift her head, but her eyes flicked up, quick and clear, taking in every word. Leon's hand stilled on the cart handle. The muscles in his jaw worked once, then locked. $1 billion on the table, a billionaire under siege, and a janitor's daughter nobody noticed. But sometimes the quietest seat in the room belongs to the person about to change everything. The private dining room at Skyline Hall floated above the bay like a crystal box. City lights climbed the glass walls, bridges and ferries glowing against the dark water. A long walnut table stretched through the center, polished so smooth it reflected every flicker of the candles. Plates waited in precise rows, silver catching small bursts of flame. Around it, voices hummed low, business laughter edged with calculation. At the room's edge, Leon Knight steered a cleaning cart across the marble. His hands were wide and worn, knuckles nicked from years of work. The navy coverall on his shoulders was pressed but faded at the seams. He moved carefully, wiping an invisible ring from the floor, always keeping one eye on the table and the other on the small figure seated beside the cart. Kendra sat with her legs tucked under, a battered notebook open across her knees. Pencil in hand, she shaped characters with neat, deliberate strokes. Jian Eru, Jing Yi, Jing. Every few moments she looked up, scanning faces the way some children watch clouds, waiting for a change. The laughter at the table made her fingers pause. She tilted her head, alert. Preston Hale poured more wine and let his gaze drift toward the back of the room. It snagged on the girl for half a heartbeat before sliding away, but a small crease had formed between his brows. Douglas Ray kept talking, but his eyes flicked to Leon, faint irritation behind the smile. As if the janitor's quiet presence were an intrusion he hadn't ordered. Leon shifted his stance, placing himself between them and Kendra without breaking the rhythm of his work. He set a folded towel on the edge of the cart, a signal only the girl would read. She nodded once, small and sure, then bent over her page, underlining Jian Eru, to be seen, before sketching a box around it. The room smelled of roasted duck and lemon oil, expensive and sharp. Glass chimed when someone reached for a bottle. Beyond the windows, fog teased the bridge cables, smudging the lights into streaks of silver. Inside, the air seemed to balance on a wire, elegance above, quiet vigilance below. And in the corner, a child no one had invited was writing the language of storms, waiting for the first crack in the calm. Victor Tanaka sat at the end of the walnut table, posture straight, hands resting lightly in front of him. Born in Osaka, once a boy soldering circuits in a borrowed garage, he'd grown into the mind behind the world's smallest surgical robots. Tonight he wore a charcoal jacket, no tie, no watch, just a silver crane pinned to his lapel. He looked at the skyline instead of the men across from him, calm as stone in a storm. Douglas Ray lounged opposite, one arm draped across the chair, a gleaming watch catching the candlelight each time he gestured. His grin was practiced, the kind that usually made rooms bend toward him. Preston Hale sat to his right, younger, sleeves too crisp for how often he twitched with energy. He slid a thin sheet of paper back into the contract folder, tucking something smaller into his pocket before smoothing his tie. "Let's be honest," Douglas said, voice warm but cut sharp underneath. "You've built a masterpiece, Victor, but markets don't wait. Our board wants an answer before midnight." Preston leaned in, eyes bright. "Say yes tonight and your tech goes global before the quarter ends. Say no and, well, opportunities move fast." The words landed like hooks thrown across the table. Douglas kept talking numbers, painting pictures of hospitals signing lifetime deals, but his gaze never left Victor's face, waiting for a crack. Victor didn't give him one. He closed the folder in front of him with a quiet click, steady as a gavel. The sound made Preston's fingers freeze against his glass. At the far wall, Leon adjusted the handle of his cart, inching closer to Kendra. She kept her head down, pencil moving over neat strokes of kanji, but her eyes tracked every flick of paper, every look passed between the men. Something in Preston's pocket had caught her attention, a folded slip he didn't want seen. Victor finally looked up. "I hear your urgency," he said, voice even, a hint of accent brushing the words. "But good work deserves more than a countdown." Douglas's smile thinned for the first time. Preston cleared his throat, restless again. The deal was supposed to be simple. Instead, the room had begun to tilt, just slightly, toward the man who hadn't said much at all. Preston Hale spun the stem of his glass, impatience twitching in every motion. "We might as well be negotiating with a statue," he said, voice pitched just loud enough. "A brilliant one, sure, but still." He tilted his chin toward Victor, smirking. "Maybe a bonsai mascot for the lab." Douglas laughed, quick and smooth. "Preston," he said, as if teasing a child, then turned and flicked a hand toward the edge of the room. "Wine, please." His smile barely reached his eyes as he signaled Leon like a man calling for a tool, not a person. Leon stepped forward, steadying the bottle. Preston nudged his glass, pushing it closer, daring a spill. Leon kept his focus, filling it to the line, then retreated to the quiet strip of marble without a word. Douglas had already gone back to selling futures and profits. Kendra watched from her stool, pencil frozen mid-stroke. Her gaze slid across the table, polished shoes under walnut, Douglas's slick grin, Preston's restless heel bumping the cloth. A thin slip of paper peeked from Preston's pocket where he'd hidden something moments ago. Preston leaned closer, voice low but sharp. "Honestly, we could swap him for a chatbot and no one would notice." He snickered into his wine. Victor turned a single page, slow and deliberate. The hush after the paper's rustle felt heavier than the insult. Douglas gave another small wave for plates to be cleared, his tone too sweet to hide the order. Leon gathered the dishes, eyes calm but jaw tight. Kendra glanced at her father, reading the quiet warning there. "Hold steady." She slipped the pencil behind her ear, heartbeat quick. Around the table, laughter rang a little too bright, and every gesture seemed to push the line further. She underlined the word she'd just written, Sheng, voice, and boxed it hard. Preston tapped the folder again, eager, while Douglas kept smiling. But the silence sitting between Victor Tanaka and the men across from him had shifted, waiting for someone to break it. Kendra's pencil rested on the boxed kanji, and the room blurred into a memory. She was 6, cross-legged on a tatami mat in a narrow apartment that smelled of steamed rice and lemon polish. Ayumi, her mother, knelt beside her with a brush and paper. "Breathe, then move," Ayumi said, guiding her daughter's small hand across the page. The stroke was slow, exact. Every mark shows respect. She bowed after each character, steady and deliberate, teaching Kendra that silence could speak louder than words. The lessons ended too soon. Ayumi's breath grew shallow, hospital lights replacing the warm lamp on their table. Leon carried Kendra through white corridors, his face tight as nurses whispered about unpaid bills. By spring, Ayumi was gone, leaving a stack of notebooks pressed with camellia petals. Leon didn't talk about grief. He just worked. Mornings repairing railings in a train yard, nights polishing brass and wiping glass for people who never learned his name. The pay barely covered school, but he tucked every spare dollar into an envelope marked for Kendra's future. He couldn't leave her alone at home. So most evenings, she sat near his cart, copying kanji while he cleaned halls built for someone else's celebration. She learned to listen while keeping still. The squeak of wheels, the scrape of cloth, the tones people used when they thought a janitor couldn't hear. Back in the dining room, Kendra blinked away the past. Her father stood a few steps off, shoulders squared as he cleared another plate. Laughter from the table struck sharp against the quiet they'd built together. She looked at the characters on her page, Jian Eru to be seen. Her hand tightened around the pencil. Ayumi's voice felt close again. Every line is a promise. Finish what you start. Kendra set the tip of her pencil to paper, steady now. Around her, the deal talk quickened, Preston's voice rising, Douglas's smile narrowing. The soft lessons of another life were bracing her for a room that hadn't yet guessed how much she'd learned. Leon eased the cart against the wall, taking the brief lull while the waitstaff laid out the next course. A soft buzz lit up his phone in his pocket. He pulled it out with the discretion of a man used to working in the background. A message from Auntie Glow glowed on the screen. "Remember, that girl is your blood. Teach her to keep her head high." A small smile broke through the tight set of his jaw. He slid the phone back, a quiet anchor settling in his chest. For a heartbeat, the polished room faded. He was back on the docks in Oakland years ago. Younger. Sleeves rolled. Standing shoulder to shoulder with friends from the yard. They'd gathered outside the shipwright's office after another round of unfair layoffs, faces taut, voices steady. Someone had brought a hand-painted sign that read, "Fair work, fair wages." Leon remembered the salt wind, the low rumble of men refusing to be unseen. He hadn't spoken much, but he'd stayed until the bosses were forced to look them in the eye. That memory had been a compass ever since. It taught him that quiet could carry strength if you refused to bow to the wrong things. Tonight, the same current stirred under his ribs. He glanced at Kendra. She was still bent over her notebook, brows drawn in focus, the kanji sharp against the paper. Her small back looked fragile, but there was something in her posture, straight, unwavering, that mirrored the men at the shipyard gate. Pride, unspoken but firm. Across the room, Preston tipped his chair back just enough to scrape the floor, laughing at something Douglas said. Leon returned to his post, placing himself between the table and his daughter, shoulders broad, calm set deep. In a space built to erase people like them, he felt Auntie Glow's words again, steady as a drumbeat. Teach her to keep her head high. And for the first time that night, the balance in the room felt less fixed, as if someone outside the contract had already begun to shape how this story might end. Preston Hale tipped his chair back, balancing it on two legs while spinning his glass by the stem. His smile was all teeth, but there was an edge under it, restless and sharp. "Tell me," he said, loud enough for the whole table, "is this a business dinner or a bonsai class?" He let the words hang, then added, Maybe our friend here is waiting for someone to trim the branches before he speaks. Douglas chuckled, leaning back, perfectly at ease in the room he thought he owned. Come on, Preston, he drawled, eyes sliding toward Victor. Maybe we just need flashcards. Something with big letters. Yes, no, maybe. Help him get to the point. A ripple of laughter circled the table, brittle against the hum of the city beyond the glass. Kendra's pencil froze on the page. She didn't look up, not fully, but her lashes lifted just enough to catch Preston's smirk and Douglas's lazy grin. The quiet curiosity in her face hardened into something older than 11. Victor Tanaka didn't move right away. He sat with hands folded, gaze fixed on the skyline where fog brushed the bridge lights. For a moment the silence deepened, heavy enough that Preston's chair legs thumped back onto the floor. Victor exhaled slowly, the sound barely more than breath. Underneath it came a murmur in Japanese, soft but clear. Does anyone see me? Douglas blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. What was that? He asked, still smiling but not as easily now. Victor's eyes shifted from the window to the men across from him. He didn't repeat the words. Instead, he picked up his water glass, calm and steady, as if the remark had never left his lips. But the air around the table changed, thin as wire. Even Preston hesitated, his fingers loosening on the stem of his glass. Leon, standing near the wall, felt the tremor inside the quiet. He eased his cart closer to Kendra, shielding her line of sight. But she leaned forward anyway, notebook half forgotten. She'd grown up around grown-ups who used silence as a shield, but she'd never seen anyone wield it like this. Douglas cleared his throat, forcing the moment back onto his terms. Look, Victor, he said, putting false warmth in the name. We're just trying to make sure you understand how urgent this is. $1 billion merger doesn't wait on mystery pauses. Preston grinned again, but there was a flicker of doubt behind it. He reached for the contract folder as if paper could steady him. Maybe we should print a checklist, he joked, voice too quick. Box for yes, box for no. It's box for... Victor set down his glass with deliberate care. I understand perfectly, he said, voice even. I'm considering everything that isn't written in your documents. His gaze held theirs a beat too long, calm but unyielding. Preston looked away first, and Douglas's fingers tightened against the polished wood. Kendra's pencil moved again, tracing a single stroke across the page, but her eyes stayed on Victor. Something in the room had shifted. Quiet, dangerous, waiting for someone brave enough to answer it. Foster appeared at Leon's shoulder like a shadow that knew the room better than the people in it. Crisp shirt, clipped tone. Keep the kid out of sight, he said, eyes on the cart, not the man. Last warning, Leon. We have donors in the room. Leon didn't argue. He never did. Yes, sir. He eased the cart a half step, placing his body between the table and the stool. His hands, those steady hands, tightened on the handle until the knuckles blanched. Kendra heard everything. The words landed hot, then cold. Her fingers trembled against the pencil, leaving a faint skid of graphite across the margin. She kept her head down as if she were still writing, but her gaze lifted through her lashes to the end of the table where Victor sat. The room hummed with small sounds, silver on china, a cork whispering free, a shoe scuffing marble. But all she saw was the quiet man who had just asked if anyone could see him. Foster lowered his voice and leaned closer to Leon. Policy is clear. No minors on the floor, he said, tapping an invisible rule in the air. If a guest notices, I have to make a move. Don't put me in that spot. I understand. The words were work-worn and small. They tasted like the paper envelopes Leon kept for bills and school fees. Preston laughed at something Douglas had said, the sound bright and thin. He reached for the contract again, thumb sliding a folded slip deeper into his pocket. Kendra caught that quick motion. She'd seen it before, earlier, when the men were still pretending at courtesy. Something he wanted hidden, something that didn't belong in a celebration. Her hand steadied on the page, hovering over the boxed character for voice. She looked at her father. He felt her looking. A glance, that was all. A conversation without sound. "I'm here. Stay small. Hold steady." She nodded, but the nod didn't reach her chest. Foster stepped back, smoothing his tie. He gave Leon a final look that said compliance counted more than dignity. Then he turned to the servers and began moving plates with soft orders that felt like erasures. Kendra's mind ran in 2 lanes at once. One lane was warning, rules, regimes, consequences. The other was memory, her mother's brush lifting after a perfect stroke, that gentle bow that said, "I see you," without a single word. Silence had been reverence in their tiny apartment. In rooms like this, it was a leash. Douglas cleared his throat, drawing the table back to his timeline. "Before midnight," he repeated, casual menace tucked into the hour. Preston nodded too quickly and bumped his glass. Red crept up the crystal before settling. He didn't notice. He was watching Victor the way boys watch locked doors, certain the key is already in their pocket. Victor remained composed. A page turned. A breath held. The quiet around him tightened, not empty but coiled. "Leon," Foster called softly without looking up. "Bread plates." Leon moved. He worked with the precision of someone who could not afford a mistake. Kendra tracked his steps, counting them the way she counted strokes of ink. 4 to the table, 1 to the left. Set, turn, step away. Invisible choreography in a room that pretended it choreographed everything. Preston's gaze snagged on Kendra again, longer this time. A frown, quick and dismissive, like sweeping a crumb off linen. She dropped her eyes to the notebook, but the pencil didn't move. Her thoughts were too loud. If nobody speaks, they decide what your silence means. Foster reappeared, voice flatter now. "Leon," he said, "I need her behind the screen. If anyone asks, she's on her way out." He glanced at the nearest security camera, a small black glass eye in the corner, before adding, "Don't make me write this up." Leon's breath caught. Understood. He reached for the stool, ready to wheel it behind the lacquered screen that hid the station. Kendra's heel anchored on the marble. She looked up, not at Foster, not at the camera. At Victor. The man who had asked into the room and got his words swallowed by chandeliers. Her pulse climbed into her throat. The muscles in her hand remembered a brush, the rhythm of a bow, her mother's voice. "Finish what you start." She traced a single, silent stroke in the air, then closed the notebook as if sealing a promise between pages. "Now, Leon," Foster pressed on. Leon nodded, but he didn't move the stool yet. He positioned himself to shield her from the table while he shifted the cart. His body made a wall the way he always had when storms pushed against thin windows. Kendra inhaled. The air tasted like wine and lemon oil and something iron underneath. She told herself to be still. She told herself to vanish. Across the walnut, Victor's fingers paused. His eyes lifted and met hers. Not an accident, not a drift, but a look that landed and held. No words, just the smallest acknowledgement. "I see you." Something in her spine straightened. The fear didn't leave. It changed shape. It became a boundary she could step over. Foster was still talking. Plates were still moving. The men at the table were still making a future without asking who had to live in it. Kendra slid the pencil behind her ear and placed the notebook on the cart. She felt the shackle of silence, cold and familiar. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a rule. It felt like a lock she finally knew how to turn. Kendra slid off the stool before anyone noticed she was moving. 1 breath, 2 steps. The marble was cool through her sneakers. Leon reached for the stool to pull her back behind the screen, but she was already past his hand, already inside the spill of candlelight that marked the table's edge. "Hey," Foster hissed. Too late. Kendra stopped at the corner of the walnut, straightened her spine, and bowed. Slow, precise, deeper than courtesy, the kind of bow that says, "I see you, and I respect you, and I mean no harm." When she rose, her hands were folded in front of her, fingers laced to keep them from shaking. "Shiri shimasu," she said softly. Shitsure shimasu. Excuse me. The room went still. A fork paused mid-air. Preston's chair legs thumped back to the floor. Douglas's smile held, but only because he hadn't learned yet how to lose it. Kendra turned to the man at the end of the table. Tianchong-yang, monshiwake arimasen. Tanaka-sama, monshiwake arimasen. Ganyotsu nagara, skoshi dake otetsudai shite mo ii desu ka? With respect, may I help? Just a little? Victor's expression shifted by a fraction, the faintest surprise passing like a shadow across glass. He didn't look at Douglas or Preston. He looked at the child who had just bowed, as if this were a temple and not a rooftop with contracts on the plates. Arigatou gozaimasu, he answered, measured. Arigatou gozaimasu. Junha, Ribonyu ga wakaru? You understand Japanese? Kendra nodded once. Hai, muga shoyete kuremashita. Yes, my mother taught me. Enough, Foster snapped in a whisper that wasn't a whisper. Leon, get her. Leon moved in, big and careful, ready to guide his daughter back to the safe edge of the room. Kendra glanced up at him. Not pleading, not stubborn. Just a steady look, dark eyes clear. Trust me. It was the same look she'd given him in a hospital hallway years ago when she'd stopped crying because his hands needed to be free. His arm fell to his side. He didn't step away. He stood guard where he was. Preston found his voice first. Is this a performance? He said, laughing too brightly. We doing dinner theater now? He looked around for agreement that didn't come. Cute trick, kid. Kendra didn't answer him. She kept her eyes on Victor. You asked if anyone sees you, she said in English, her voice small but steady. I do. Then in Japanese, Jan ete masu. You are seen. Something in Victor's posture loosened. Not relief, not victory. Recognition. He inclined his head to her, a quiet exchange that didn't belong to the men across the table. Douglas cleared his throat, trying to catch up to the moment. She's a child, he said, chuckling like this would all dissolve if he supplied the right tone. We appreciate the cultural enthusiasm, but this is a confidential business meeting. Kendra turned toward him just enough to be polite. I'm sorry for interrupting, she said, English now, careful and clear. I know I'm not supposed to speak, but when people are treated with less respect than they deserve, silence feels like lying. She faced Victor again. Oyanshi wo kichinto tsutai sasete kudasai. Please allow me to carry your words properly. Preston's jaw tightened. We already have translators, he said, jerking his chin at the end of the table where a hired interpreter sat too still. We don't need a mascot. The word came back to bite him as soon as it left his mouth. Victor didn't look at Preston. I would like to hear her, he said. English precise, accent light. If the room permits. That single line shifted weight. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The request didn't come from a place that asked permission for long. Foster tried again, gentler and more dangerous. Leon, he said. Please. Leon's reply was almost invisible. She'll be quick, he said, eyes still on Douglas and Preston. Then I'll move her. The words were a bridge he could carry in one hand. Kendra set her notebook on the edge of the table and placed her small palm flat on the cover as if to keep the pages from blowing. She faced Victor, dipped a shorter bow, and spoke in Japanese, crisp and respectful. Tian Zhongyang, Shihaya no seosou no mano no sume desu. Koko de hanasu chikaku wa arimasen. Demo, satsuki no kanto chiba wa taisei deshita. Doushitemo kyosaretaku nakatta. I'm the night janitor's daughter. I don't have the right to speak here, but what you said mattered. I couldn't let it be erased. Victor's gaze held hers. Jun no min kian ha, he asked. Your name? Kendra, she said. Kendra Knight. Douglas drummed fingers against wood, impatience leaking out as charm failed. We are not doing this, he announced, as if the air would obey him. Victor, if you want clarity, our translator can... Kendra didn't raise her voice, but she didn't yield the floor. I can translate, she said to Douglas now, carefully neutral. If Mr. Tanaka wants that, I'll be direct. No drama. She drew a breath. "And I'll be brief." Her eyes cut to Preston's pocket and back again, a flash of knowledge she didn't spend yet. Victor turned a palm up, a small invitation. "Oyuan ishimasu," he said. "Please." The room gathered itself around that word. The servers froze the way people do when they sense a change they can't name. Preston leaned back, searching for a joke that wouldn't come. Douglas's smile held, but the corners trembled. Kendra shifted her stance, feet planted. She translated Victor's last answer into English so cleanly that even the silver seemed to listen. Then she looked at the contract folder on the table, not touching it, only measuring. Her voice stayed level. "He understands your urgency," she said to Douglas and Preston, "but he won't be rushed into a decision that erases the meaning of his work." Leon exhaled, a sound no one marked but her. Foster stared at the back of Kendra's head like he could will her into disappearing. The interpreter lowered his eyes, unsure of his place. Kendra bowed again, a notch shorter, keeping the respect thick in the air. "If I'm out of line, I will go," she said to Victor, Japanese returning like home. "Demo, jinha, oshu rishitai to omoimashita." But right now, I wanted to protect this. Victor answered with the smallest smile, one that didn't reach his mouth so much as it lifted the weight around it. "Fenkatsuta," he said. "Understood." Silence settled, a different kind than before. Not the kind that weak men used to control a room, but the kind that arrives when something honest crosses a line it wasn't supposed to cross and refuses to be forced back. Kendra kept her hands folded, the night pressed close to the glass, and for the first time since the dinner began, the power in the room turned its head. Kendra kept her hands folded a moment longer, then glanced at Victor. "May I?" she asked, eyes flicking to the leather folder near his plate. Victor nodded once. "Please." She drew the folder closer, careful not to smudge the neat stack. The paper was heavy, the kind meant to feel important. She opened to the top page, scanned, then flipped past the gloss. Her finger ran the margin, stopping where the text tightened into smaller print. "Section 9B, she said, voice quiet but clear. "Intellectual property. It says," she read, lips shaping each word, "unrestricted right to renegotiate all licenses post-merger, including derivative works and improvements, at the acquirer's sole discretion." Her eyes lifted to Douglas and Preston. "That means after the deal closes, you can change who owns what, however you want." Preston gave a bright grin. "Standard language," he said. "Just flexibility. Companies need it when they integrate." Kendra looked down again. "It also says, without prior written consent, including from founders, inventors, or key personnel." She tapped the line gently. "That part is not standard. That part removes Mr. Tanaka's say over the technology he created." Douglas shrugged. "This is how grown-up mergers work," he said, the smile turning patronizing. "We streamline. Nobody is erasing anyone." Kendra turned one page. "There's a cross-reference," she murmured, tracing a footnote number. "Addendum 3, Royalty and Attribution." She flipped to the back, found it, and slid the sheet free. "Here. Brand consolidation to acquirer mark within 12 months. Legacy marks retired. Attribution at acquirer's reasonable business judgment." She lifted her chin, small and steady. "That retires the Tanaka Robotics name from future devices." Victor's hands stayed folded. Only the smallest shift of his shoulders changed, as if a weight had landed there and he'd chosen to carry it without showing a strain. Kendra looked back at the stack. "Section 14, she said. "Non-compete," she read aloud again. "Directly or indirectly, in any capacity, globally, for 10 years, including consulting, advising, teaching, publishing, or speaking on substantially similar technologies." She paused over the next clause, then repeated it. "Including appearances at conferences or academic institutions that may influence market perception." Douglas's laugh sounded like cut glass. "Come on," he said. "Nobody's banning speeches. It's a safeguard." Protects the investment. Kendra's eyes didn't leave the page. It's not a safeguard, she said. It's a muzzle. It prevents him from teaching surgeons, training students, or even giving a talk about his own field. It keeps his name off the stage. She looked up. If he can't speak, and his brand is retired, and his patents can be reassigned, then 5 years from now, when someone uses his robot in an operating room, they won't know who built it. 10 years from now, people will say your company invented it. She glanced at Victor. That is erasing him. Preston leaned forward, tapping the table with one finger. Nobody is erasing anybody, he said, voice tightening. We're aligning incentives. This is how markets... Kendra shook her head once. The words don't match what you said. She touched the addendum again, then the footnote. You hid the most important parts in small print and attachments. Foster shifted near the wall. Kendra, he warned softly, sweat brightening his hairline. Leon stood very still, shoulders square. He watched her like a man listening for a train he couldn't stop and hoping the tracks would hold. Kendra turned to Victor, switching languages as naturally as breathing. Tianzhong yang, koko desu, she said, pointing to the line. Here. Kono jiaoxiang ha maishou no ato de anata no gijutsu no kishoku to hatsugen no kenryu o odoimasu. Mingmai mo fasshin mo kyosaremasu. This clause takes your right to be credited and to speak after the merger. Your name and your voice, gone. Victor's jaw worked once. He didn't look at Douglas. He didn't look at Preston. He looked at the paper as if it were a map with a river drawn wrong. Douglas spread his hands. Look, he said, sliding charm back into place. 10 years flies. You'll be rich, your engineers will have jobs, and the tech will save lives. Isn't that what matters? Kendra didn't answer him. She turned 2 more pages. 9B also says affiliates and assigns, she said. That means you can sell pieces to shell companies, and he won't even know which one holds his work. Attribution would disappear in a maze. She stopped on a paragraph that had been buried beneath numbers. And here, she added softly, waiver of moral rights where applicable. She looked up, and the room felt smaller for a second. That is the right to be recognized as the author. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke. Even the windows seemed to hush. Preston recovered first. What are we doing? He scoffed, reaching for the folder. Listening to a child dissect legal language? Victor rested a hand on the corner of the page. He didn't tug. He didn't need to. Preston's hand retreated, almost involuntarily. Kendra's voice stayed even. I'm not a lawyer, she said. But I know what these words do. She touched the clause again, the way her mother had once guided her hand to make a perfect line. They take the thing he made and make it look like you made it, and they make it hard for anyone to say otherwise. Douglas's smile thinned to nothing. Our counsel will explain if there's confusion, he said, but the confidence was slipping, like a suit a size too large. Kendra slid the papers back into perfect order and closed the folder with a careful tap. She turned to Victor one more time, Japanese settling into its clean lines. Kore ha bizinesu no supi do de hanaku, anata no shungya no chenka no hanas desu, she said. This isn't about the speed of business, it's about your life's work. Then to Douglas and Preston in English, if this is your best offer, it's also your loudest intention. You don't want a partner. You want to write him out of his own story. Across the table, Preston's knuckles whitened around his glass. Douglas stared at the closed folder, and for the first time since the night began, winning didn't look inevitable. Leon moved without a sound, stepping out from the shadow near the service station. He placed one steady hand on Kendra's shoulder, the weight of it quiet but solid, like a post driven deep into earth. She didn't flinch. She let the warmth settle, felt the years behind it, the nights he carried her through rain, the mornings he left early so she could keep a seat in classrooms where no one expected her to stay. For a moment, the table blurred. Leon's mind slid back to voices on a cold Oakland pier, the smell of rust and salt clinging to denim jackets. Men and women stood together in the wind, A line of black workers fighting for fair pay and the right not to disappear behind their labor. Someone had said, "Our people fought to stay in the room." That sentence lodged itself in him, and it lived in his palm now as it rested on his daughter. Kendra looked up at him, eyes searching for permission or courage, maybe both. He gave neither in words, only a small nod. The nod said, "I'm here. Whatever you say next, you don't stand alone." Douglas tried to cut the moment, voice heavy with forced cheer. "Well, this has become quite the family symposium," he said, fingers drumming against the folder. "Let's get back to grown-up business." Preston smirked, ready to add something, but the expression faded when Leon's gaze settled on him. Calm, unblinking, the look of someone who'd spent decades swallowing insults until they lost their sting. Preston looked down, pretending to adjust his watch. Kendra turned toward the men at the table, still feeling her father's hand steady on her shoulder. "When my mother taught me kanji," she said, "she told me every stroke carries the writer's name. If you let someone take the page, they take the name too." Her voice was small, but it threaded through the room with a clarity that didn't need volume. Victor's mouth curved just slightly, recognition in the line of it. He didn't speak, but the silence around him felt less like surrender, more like space being cleared. Leon stayed behind Kendra, not pushing, not pulling her back. He was there as proof that she came from a line of people who refused to vanish simply because someone else preferred them quiet. Foster shifted near the door, hands half raised, unsure if he should end this or let it play. The servers kept still, their trays suspended mid-air. Kendra drew a breath and met Douglas's stare. "You asked for clarity," she said. "Clarity is, this contract was written to make Mr. Tanaka disappear from his own invention. That isn't partnership." She glanced at Victor. "And it isn't respect." Douglas opened his mouth, but the words snagged somewhere between calculation and disbelief. Leon's fingers gave the smallest squeeze on Kendra's shoulder, steady as a heartbeat. He didn't need to speak. The message was written in the set of his shoulders, in the quiet pride of a man who'd spent years teaching his child how to read rooms that weren't built for her. Around them, the city pressed close against the glass, waiting. The room felt narrower, as if the center had shifted from polished suits and contracts to a single father and daughter standing exactly where they weren't supposed to, and refusing to move. Kendra shifted the folder a little closer, letting the pages fan out under the candlelight. Her eyes swept across the margin where tiny gray letters shimmered against the cream paper. Not ink. Something faint, almost hidden. She leaned closer, fingers pressing the edge flat so the light hit at an angle. There it was again, clear once you knew where to look. A watermark, pale as smoke. H-Tech, internal draft. Do not circulate. Her heartbeat jumped. H-Tech was Tanaka Robotics' private research arm, the one Victor guarded like a vault. These papers weren't supposed to leave an encrypted server, let alone ride into a dinner on Douglas Ray's table. She traced the letters lightly, careful not to call attention too fast. Then she looked up, scanning faces in order. Douglas lounging, perfectly at ease. Victor still, unreadable. Preston watching the room too hard for someone who claimed boredom. His fingers worried the rim of his glass, tapping once, twice, then stopping the moment her gaze touched his. A faint flush crawled up his neck. Kendra lowered her eyes again, letting the quiet stretch just long enough. She turned another page, more clauses, more footnotes. And there, near the binding, the same watermark. Whoever handed this contract to Raygen had access deep inside Victor's walls. Leon caught her glance. It lasted no longer than a blink, but it steadied her. She looked back at the print, voice small but even. "Mr. Tanaka," she said, "this draft wasn't meant for outside review." She placed one finger along the watermark. "See this? H-Tech internal. It means someone from your own circle sent a working file." Douglas leaned in, brows raised as if she'd produced a magic trick. Probably a formatting note, he said lightly. Legal teams leave all kinds of marks. Victor took the paper from her and tilted it toward the candles. His eyes narrowed, sharp behind the calm. No, he said softly. The mark belongs to a secure repository. Preston cleared his throat too fast. Maybe someone forwarded the wrong attachment, he said, smile tight, eyes darting anywhere but the page. His hand slid toward his pocket, brushing the folded slip Kendra had already clocked earlier. The movement wasn't big, but it was enough. Kendra watched him, unblinking. Whoever leaked this, she said quietly, didn't just send notes. They sent every protection clause, the architecture behind the patents, the very lines that kept Mr. Tanaka's team safe. Her finger traced the watermark again, then stilled. If this document reached you before tonight, it wasn't an accident. Douglas looked between Preston and the folder, his own composure bending at the edges. Preston? He asked, voice soft in a way that didn't match his usual polish. Preston straightened, forcing a laugh that came out brittle. I review documents, he said. That's my job. Kendra kept her gaze steady, the same calm her father had carried on the shipyard picket line. Then maybe your job is showing, she said. Victor slid the papers back into order, eyes never leaving Preston. The silence that followed wasn't the same as before. It was sharper, charged with the sense that a line had just been drawn. Somewhere behind the contracts and candlelight, a door inside the story had opened, and the air on the other side promised a reckoning. Victor didn't rush. He gathered the folder's pages, squared them with one careful tap, then lifted his gaze to the quiet man seated a few chairs down, a discreet aide in a dark jacket who had been invisible all evening. A slight nod passed between them. The aide reached inside his pocket and drew out a device no larger than a deck of cards, matte silver with one round button. He placed it on the table, just beside the crystal decanter. The room felt smaller in an instant. Douglas shifted in his seat, charm sliding into place like a mask. What's this? He asked, half amused, half wary. A gadget demo? Victor spoke evenly. A record of how tonight began. His eyes stayed on Douglas and Preston. Transparency. The aide pressed the button. A faint chime, then voices filled the space. Familiar voices, stripped of polish by a hidden microphone. Cut the founder out early, Douglas's voice said, grainy but clear. If we fold the IP into a holding company, the patents are ours before he knows the ink's dry. Preston's laugh followed, too sharp. Strip the credits, retire the brand, and by the time he protests, we're 2 shells deep, all clean. A low whistle ran along the table, someone's breath escaping. Foster froze near the wall, plate in hand. Kendra stayed perfectly still, her fingers curled around the edge of her notebook. Douglas cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. Come on, he said lightly. Anyone can splice audio. Victor didn't respond. He gave Kendra a small, almost imperceptible signal. She understood. She placed her palm on the table, spine straight. When she spoke, her voice was careful. Each word like a step on glass. They said, she translated, eyes steady, to cut the founder out early, to move the patents into another company so you would not notice until it was done. They said the credits could be stripped, the name retired, and by the time you protested, everything would be hidden. Preston's smile faltered. He looked at Douglas, then back at the device. That's taken out of context, he said quickly. We were brainstorming legal scenarios. Kendra continued, calm as stone. They also said, by the time he protests, we're 2 shells deep. That means shell companies. Her gaze flicked once to the watermark still faint on the contract. Like the ones mentioned there. Douglas leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands laced as if he could hold the narrative still. Victor, let's be rational, he said. Deals get messy, Pimku-san. People talk strategy. Doesn't mean we act on every option. The recording played on, unmoved by charm or excuses. Non-compete's tight, Preston's voice said. He can't teach, publish, nothing. He fades and we keep the field. The aide stopped the device. Silence dropped like weight. Victor studied Preston, then Douglas. His expression didn't change, but the room felt the shift, a center of gravity moving away from their side of the table. Preston reached for his glass, hand unsteady. "Okay," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't belong. "We were spitballing, that's all." Kendra translated the last line for Victor in Japanese, her tone even, almost gentle. "Birahayan imashita, jingye bichi de anata wo fu-ri, kaoeru koto mo hanasu koto mo dekinaku saseru to." They said they would use the non-compete to tie your hands, to stop you from teaching or speaking. Victor inclined his head in thanks, then folded his hands atop the closed folder. The gesture was quiet, but it rang louder than anything said that night. Douglas tried again, voice a shade lower. "Look, Victor, business is competitive. We get protective. But you know us. We build partnerships." Kendra met his eyes, steady. "Partnership doesn't start with hiding papers and recording plans to erase someone." Leon stepped half a pace closer behind his daughter, silent, but present. A wall that didn't need height to hold. Preston's composure cracked first. "This is absurd," he snapped, leaning forward. "We came here in good faith, and now we're on trial because a janitor's kid." Victor lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Careful," he said, calm but cutting. "That child understands the language you pretend to respect. She also understands truth." The weight of that landed everywhere, in Douglas's rigid shoulders, in Foster's clenched jaw, in the servers frozen by the door. Kendra lowered her eyes for a heartbeat, then looked back up. "Mr. Tanaka," she said softly, "your work deserves a room that speaks it honestly." Her gaze moved once more to Preston, who was pale under the warm lights. "Not a room that hides knives behind contracts." The device stayed on the table, mute but heavy, proof of what had been whispered when they thought no one could hear. And around it, the power in the room settled into a new shape, one that no longer leaned toward Douglas and Preston, but toward the man and the child who had chosen to stand. Foster finally snapped out of the stunned silence. He pushed away from the wall, voice low but edged. "That's enough," he said, stepping toward Leon and Kendra. "You've both crossed a line. This is a private meeting. You don't belong here." Leon shifted, ready to take the hit if it meant shielding his daughter. But Kendra stood where she was, eyes still on Victor, notebook clutched like a shield made of paper and ink. "Mr. Knight," Foster pressed, "take your child and go. I'll explain to management that you—" A voice cut through the room, deep and steady. "No, you won't." Every head turned toward the entrance. A tall black man in a midnight suit stepped inside, calm as if the moment were waiting for him. Marvin Cole, one of the quiet investors whose name sat near the top of the deal sheet, closed the door behind him with a deliberate click. "They're not ruining anything," Marvin said, moving closer. "They just saved your deal." Foster blinked, thrown off balance. "Mr. Cole, this is a man and his daughter protecting a legacy," Marvin said, nodding at Leon and Kendra. "If you're about to punish that, you don't understand what you're selling." Douglas opened his mouth, thought better, and sat back. Preston shifted in his chair, eyes darting between the newcomer and the recorder still on the table. Marvin rested a hand against the back of an empty chair, steady as bedrock. "I swept floors in Palo Alto for 3 years, he said. "Cleaned labs after people with stock options went home. I watched engineers scribble breakthroughs on whiteboards I wasn't allowed to touch." His eyes softened but stayed sharp. "I built my first seed fund while mopping a server room at night." Kendra's breath caught. Leon's shoulders eased just a fraction. "I know what it's like," Marvin continued, "to stand in a room that tells you you're invisible, while it counts on your silence to stay comfortable." He looked at Foster, then at Douglas and Preston. These two didn't disrespect this meeting. They gave it a spine. Victor inclined his head toward Marvin, acknowledgement passing between men who understood what it cost to hold a boundary. Foster hesitated, his usual command slipping. Mr. Cole, company policy. Policy won't save you from a lawsuit or a public scandal, Marvin said, voice even, but loaded with steel. What will save you is the truth that just got spoken. He gestured toward Kendra. She read the contract you tried to bury. She named the clauses that would have destroyed the very reason you came here, and she did it with more composure than the people paid to protect this deal. For a moment, the city lights outside seemed to press closer, reflecting off the glass like witnesses. Leon finally spoke, quiet but steady. I only wanted her safe. She is safe, Marvin said, because she's standing exactly where she should. He glanced at Victor, and because someone in this room knew her voice mattered. Victor gave a slight nod, his calm edged now with respect. Foster stepped back, hands lowering. He looked at Kendra, then at Leon, the anger in his face drained into something closer to shame. Marvin's eyes swept the table. If you can't see the value in what just happened, he said, maybe you're not ready for the future you're trying to buy. No one argued. The balance of the night had shifted again, away from policy and posture, toward people who had earned the right to stay in the room. Victor rose slowly from his chair, the motion quiet but commanding. The tension that had hovered above the table seemed to settle into the polished wood as he came around to where Kendra stood. He lowered himself slightly so his gaze met hers at eye level. Kendora-san, he said gently, the Japanese syllables warm and deliberate. Kendra-san, anata ha jinye sinoshon wo yotte kuremashita. You protected my voice tonight. He extended a hand. Kendra hesitated, then placed her small fingers in his palm. Victor closed his hand over hers, firm but careful, like someone holding a fragile piece of truth. Arigato, he added in English, voice steady. Thank you. Kendra blinked fast, unsure if she should bow again or simply breathe. She felt Leon at her back, a silent pillar, and the warmth of Victor's grasp anchoring her to the moment. For the first time since she'd stepped from the stool, she let herself smile, a quick, cautious thing that still reached her eyes. Marvin Cole stepped forward, folding his hands as he studied the three of them. We're standing in a room that almost destroyed a story before it was finished, he said. We can't let that repeat. He turned toward Victor, then to Douglas and Preston, making sure every corner of the table could hear. Deals matter, sure, but so does legacy. If we don't invest in the kids who see what others miss, we're just patching leaks in a sinking ship. He looked down at Kendra. How old are you, young lady? 11, she said, voice still small but steadier now. Marvin's smile broke through the seriousness for a breath. 11, and you just out-argued men with MBAs and legal teams. He faced the group again. I'm proposing a new initiative. The Black and Asian Youth Innovation Fellowship, a place for kids who've got the eyes, the discipline, the nerve to stand up for what's right, and the brains to build something new. He let the words land, then added, I want Kendra Knight to be its first and youngest representative. A ripple moved through the room, surprise from the servers, a startled glance from Foster, even Preston shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Douglas opened his mouth, then shut it, understanding this wasn't a moment he could spin. Leon's eyes widened, pride warring with disbelief. She's just a kid, he said quietly. She's also the reason this conversation is still about innovation and not litigation, Marvin replied. That counts. Victor nodded slowly. I support this. He looked at Kendra again. Your instincts, your respect, they belong in the future we build. Not just the room we saved tonight. Kendra's throat tightened. She glanced at her father. Leon gave the smallest nod, the same one that had steadied her moments before. Marvin reached for a pen from the center of the table, scrawled a quick line on the back of a spare page. First seed pledge, he said, sliding it toward Douglas. 500,000. We'll match contributions from others here before sunrise. Douglas cleared his throat, adjusting his cuffs. Rayjen will contribute, he said, no grin this time. 1 million. It's A necessary correction. Victor placed a second hand over Kendra's, sealing the gesture. This is more than business, he said softly. Tonight, you showed us what integrity looks like. Foster, still standing near the door, looked as if he wanted to speak. Instead, he stepped back, letting the new center of gravity hold. Kendra exhaled, slow and shaky, but her shoulders stayed squared. The faces around the table were no longer a blur of strangers. They were witnesses to something she hadn't known she could do. Marvin raised his glass of still water. To building rooms big enough for every voice, he said, even the smallest one. Victor echoed the toast in Japanese. Subete no shengni chang suo wo. A place for every voice. Leon finally allowed himself a smile, quiet and proud. He rested a hand on his daughter's back, steady as the first night he'd carried her through a storm. Kendra looked down at the kanji written in her notebook, Janitor to be seen. She closed the cover gently, knowing the word would never just sit on a page again. Tonight, it had stood, spoken, and changed the room. The bell over Auntie Glow's door chimed, as Leon pushed it open, guiding Kendra inside. Warm light spilled across the little cafe. Gingerbread walls lined with framed photos of block parties, church choirs, and neighborhood kids in graduation gowns. The smell of cinnamon and chicory coffee wrapped around them like a welcome-home hug. Heads turned the moment they stepped in. A dozen voices rose at once, a tide of surprise and delight. "There they are!" someone called from the back booth. Auntie Glow herself bustled out from behind the counter, flower on her apron, eyes shining. She pulled Kendra into a hug so fierce the girl laughed despite herself. "Baby, you had us all shouting at the TV," Glow said, holding her by the shoulders. "Standing there reading those papers like a lawyer in a courtroom. You made us proud." Kendra flushed, half hiding behind her notebook. Leon chuckled and settled onto a stool at the counter, easing the weariness out of his legs. The regulars closed in. Mr. Harlan from the barber shop, Miss Joyce from the daycare, a pair of retired dock workers who'd once marched beside Leon on the shipyard line. Leon lifted a hand, asking for a beat of quiet. "She stood straight," he said, voice steady. In a room full of people who thought they owned the air. She kept her voice even, read every word, and didn't let them take her place. He looked around the circle, catching each set of eyes. That little girl held $1 billion table to account. Cheers and laughter filled the shop. Someone clapped Leon on the back. Another offered to buy Kendra a slice of sweet potato pie. Auntie Glow poured coffee into heavy mugs, sliding one toward Leon. "You did good, big brother," she said softly. Kept her close, but let her shine. Kendra perched on a chair beside her father, legs swinging. For the first time since Skyline Hall, the tightness in her chest eased. She listened as the older folks swapped memories of strikes won and lost, of nights guarding each other's backs when the world turned mean. They spoke of Ayumi too, remembering how she'd taught neighborhood kids to fold paper cranes in the park. "You know," Mr. Harlan said, leaning forward, "that girl's got the kind of calm you can't teach. Must run in the family." Leon laughed, shaking his head. "She gets it from her mama," he said, then softer. "But she learned to use it because this community never let us forget who we are." Kendra glanced around the cafe. The mural of hands clasped across a painted bridge, the photos of block cleanups and chess tournaments. Every wall whispered a piece of the strength that had brought her here. She felt the weight of what Marvin had said about rooms big enough for every voice. For the first time, she believed it wasn't just an idea. It was a map. Auntie Glow set a plate of pie in front of Kendra, winked, and tapped the notebook still clutched in her lap. "Keep writing," she said. "Next time, we'll all need autographs." Kendra smiled, opening the cover just enough to see the kanji on the first page, Janitor to be seen. She traced it once with her finger, then closed the book gently. Around her, laughter and music folded into one another, filling the cafe with the kind of warmth that promised a future bigger than any deal could hold. Never underestimate the quiet ones, or their children. That night wasn't only about contracts or patents. It was about who gets to be visible, who gets to speak, and who protects the voices that risk being erased. Kendra Knight didn't come to Skyline Hall with power or title, only lessons written by a mother who believed in respect and the steady hands of a father who knew what it meant to stay in the room. What she proved is simple. Courage can live inside the smallest body, waiting for the moment someone needs it most. And when that courage is backed by a community, no table, no matter how expensive, can silence it. If this story moved you, share it. Pass it on to someone who needs a reminder that talent and integrity don't always wear suits. They clean floors, serve meals, study in corners, and dream beyond the limits set for them. Stand with the next generation of Black and Asian kids who are learning to lift their heads high. Support them, teach them, give them space to speak. Because every breakthrough begins with someone who refuses to stay invisible, and with a community willing to make room for their voice.